Hello, everyone. We're thrilled that you're joining us for the inaugural Existential Risks Conference hosted by SERI, the Stanford Existential Risk Initiative. I'm Kuhan Jayapragasan, MC for our keynote session today and the primary organizer for this conference, and I'll be giving a few opening remarks. It feels particularly timely to host a conference focused on existential risks right now. This past year has shown us the repercussions of not being prepared enough for rare, large-scale events, and just how important future-facing risk mitigation can be, especially when the whole world and our future as a species is at stake. The number of people who could exist in the future is incredibly vast. Future people are also disenfranchised. They have no say in the actions we take, who we elect, and the policies our governments enact. Yet, it is future generations who will suffer the price of so many of our short-sighted measures. Existential risks, which could permanently curtail humanity's future potential through extinction or other catastrophes, are estimated by many experts to have a likelihood greater than 10% over the coming century. This is a greater than 1 in 10 chance of all human life on Earth ending, all our family, friends, and everyone we've ever known, and a permanently extinguished future. But on a more uplifting note, if we successfully navigate and avoid catastrophe, it's hard to even dream of the limit of our future potential and what humanity may achieve. Given the urgency of these issues, it has been both relieving and inspiring to see the levels of interest that this conference has received. We have over 1,000 participants, including professors, government officials, professionals, and students from over 52 countries. Over the next 2 days, we will hear from inspiring leaders in academia, government, and industry who work tirelessly to improve the future of humanity. And we will come together as a global community and discuss diverse fields from artificial intelligence alignment to synthetic biology. This weekend, I urge each of you to think critically and engage in constructive debate. And I challenge you to walk away from each conversation having learned something new. To make the most of the experiences and global perspectives among our attendees, I highly recommend scheduling one-on-one meetings through Swapcard or schedule meeting links like Calendly, which you can find on attendees' profiles. Additionally, all speaker sessions will be uploaded to Swapcard after their completion, so feel free to attend social events and schedule meetings during our planned programming. Many of our speakers will also host post-event Q&As and office hours on Gather, the primary social platform we'll be using for this conference. So please check out the after-session Q&A track of the agenda to talk to speakers live after their sessions. Given SERI's emphasis on educating and nurturing the next generation of policymakers, researchers, educators, and advocates dedicated to existential risk reduction, I encourage everyone at this conference to think deeply about how we individually can best contribute to the complex problem of mitigating existential risks, especially through our careers. Existential risks are daunting, and it's easy to feel like there is nothing we can do about them. But just being here today is a great first step. There's already an inspiring amount of infrastructure, several organizations, significant funding, and many collaborators available for supporting work in existential risk reduction. If you're interested, please use this conference as an opportunity to connect with them. So today, I'm delighted to introduce our keynote speaker, Toby Ord. A moral philosopher at Oxford's Future of Humanity Institute, Toby researches big picture questions facing humanity. He wrote The Precipice, the now classic book on existential risks, which you can receive for free by filling out the form on Swapcard. Toby also founded an international society called Giving What We Can, whose members have pledged hundreds of millions of dollars to the most effective charities helping to improve the world. He also co-founded the wider effective altruism movement, encouraging thousands of people to use reason and evidence to help others as much as possible. Through his work, Toby has also advised organizations including the United Nations, the US National Intelligence Council, the UK Prime Minister's Office, and the World Health Organization, just to name a few. Today, he will be speaking about the importance of safeguarding our future. So without further ado, please welcome Toby Ord.
Thanks so much, Kuhan. And I think this is going to be a really exciting conference. Could we have the slides? Fantastic. So if all goes well, human history is just beginning. Humanity is 200,000 years old, but the Earth will remain habitable for hundreds of millions more, enough time for millions of future generations, enough to end disease, poverty, and injustice forever, enough to create heights of flourishing that are unimaginable today. And if we could learn to reach a little further out into the cosmos, we would have more time yet, trillions of years to explore billions of worlds. Such a lifespan would place present-day humanity in its earliest infancy. A vast and extraordinary adulthood awaits. But this entire future is at risk. In the 20th century, with the development of the atomic bomb, our escalating power finally reached the point where we could destroy ourselves and end our story. Human extinction would foreclose our future. It would destroy this potential. It would eliminate all possibilities but one, a world bereft of human flourishing. Extinction would bring about this failed world, and it would also lock it in forever. There would be no coming back. But it's not the only way that our potential could be destroyed. Consider a world in ruins, where a catastrophe has done such damage to the environment that civilization has completely collapsed and is unable to ever be re-established. Even if such a catastrophe did not cause our extinction, it would have a similar effect on our future. The vast realm of futures currently open to us would have collapsed into a narrow range of meager options. We would have a failed world with no way back. Or consider a world in chains, where the entire world has become locked under the rule of a totalitarian regime, determined to perpetuate itself. If such a regime could be maintained indefinitely, then descent into this totalitarian future would have much in common with extinction, just a narrow range of terrible futures with no way out. What all these possibilities have in common is that humanity's once soaring potential would have been permanently destroyed. Not just the loss of everything that we have, but the loss of everything that we could have ever achieved. And any such outcome is called an existential catastrophe, and the risk of it occurring is an existential risk. Humanity faces a wide range of existential risks. I find it useful to think of them in these three categories. The natural risks that we've always faced over our 200,000-year history. The current anthropogenic risks that started 75 years ago in this period that I call the precipice, where we're facing this heightened level of risk. And then these emerging risks that are just coming online. And I've highlighted a few that we might see here over the next century. And these risks aren't equal. The stakes are similar. That's what they have in common. But some of the risks, I think, are much more likely than others. In my book, I show how we can use the fossil record to bound the entire natural risk to about a 1 in 10,000 chance of occurring each century. For if it were much higher than this, then there's very little chance that we could have survived the 200,000 centuries so far. Sorry, the 2,000 centuries so far, or that related species could have typically last 10,000 centuries. But we've only faced 75 years of anthropogenic risks, so our track record is too short to draw any such comfort. And when we look at all the close calls that we've had with nuclear weapons over that time, few people would believe that we could get through 10,000 centuries like the last one. Instead, it seems that the anthropogenic risk is outstripping the natural risk. And my best guess is that the existing anthropogenic risk is roughly 30 times larger than the natural risk. And that the emerging risk is about 50 times larger again, roughly a 1 in 6 chance that humanity doesn't make it through the next century with our potential intact. Today, I want to dig a little deeper into what makes an existential catastrophe so bad, why we need to strive so hard to avoid them. In some ways, this may seem obvious. Of course, the destruction of our future would be bad, but it's less obvious exactly why it would be bad, and also just how profoundly bad it would be, or how robust the case is that this is one of the most terrible outcomes that we could face. And we need to understand this better in order to know how much to prioritize existential risk among all the pressing issues of our time, especially as many of the things that we could do would not directly make the difference between whether we survive and flourish or fail forever, but rather would just increase that chance, perhaps by a modest amount. So it's not enough to just note that it would be terrible if there was no future. We really need to know how terrible and why. I'm going to look at 5 different foundations for the importance of existential risk. Our concern could be grounded in our past, our present, or our future, or in questions of virtue or of humanity's cosmic significance. Let's take these in turn. The most obvious reasons are rooted in our present. It's technically possible to have an existential catastrophe that does relatively little harm to the people alive at the time. For example, if we all decided to have no more children, then that would destroy our future, but we may suppose cause no other suffering. But very few risks are like that. The downfall of humanity or civilization would involve untold suffering and loss, as billions of people would be killed in this catastrophe, or perhaps instead oppressed by a tyrannical regime. And the moral case for preventing such horror requires little elaboration. We've seen losses that are similar, but on much smaller scales, with thousands or millions of lives being destroyed. And other things being equal, millions of deaths must be worse than thousands, billions worse than millions. Even though we lose our ability to fully comprehend these losses, the numbers must act as a guide to the moral stakes. Even measured just in terms of the loss of life or the immediate suffering, most kinds of existential catastrophe would easily be the worst event in human history. But an existential risk doesn't just destroy our present, it destroys our future. The philosopher Derek Parfit had a thought experiment that teases out the difference. He asked us to imagine first a century of world peace, and then to imagine a nuclear war that kills 99% of all people on Earth. An absolutely devastating outcome. And then to imagine a second nuclear war that is slightly more deadly than the first, killing all 100% of people on Earth. Now, obviously, the first of those nuclear wars is worse than peace, and the second is worse than the first. But how much worse? Is the difference between peace and a war that killed 99% of all people bigger or smaller than the difference between that war and one that kills 100%? I think most of us initially are inclined to think, the numbers lead us to think that the difference between 0% and 99% is the bigger of the two. But Parfit teases out this point that in losing that last percent, it isn't just that we lose those people, but we lose our entire future. all the generations that could come after us and everything that they could achieve. A war that kills 100% doesn't just kill all humans, it kills humanity. Our future could be so much longer and better than our fleeting present. And there are actions that only our generation could take that would affect that entire span of time. And thus, that could save all of that value that is threatened by such a risk. This value of our future could be understood in many different terms. Perhaps the most obvious is in the value in all the lives, in all the future generations. And this is how it's often thought of in moral philosophy when people are discussing this. But it also could be thought of in many other terms. Because in expectation, almost all of humanity's life lies in its future. So almost everything of value lies in the future as well. Almost all the flourishing, almost all the beauty, our greatest achievements, our most just societies, our most profound discoveries. This is our potential, what we could achieve if we pass the precipice and continue striving for a better world. But all of that is at risk. So this is the long-termist argument for safeguarding humanity's potential. Our generation is just one page in a much longer story. And there are some ways that we could affect many or even all generations to come. Our focus here today is on existential risk. And it's easy to see why it is that actions that we take today could affect every generation when it comes to existential risk, because it was defined to be these cases where we lose our entire potential, where there is no way back. It's easiest to see that in the case of extinction, and why it is that people of future times who would never get to exist would have no other way of defending themselves against these risks that happen on our watch. But it could also occur to lesser degrees for other types of risks, perhaps risks that are more likely. And there may be a host of ways in which we could act in order to protect our long-term future, which would have these pan-generational effects. Perhaps a simple example comes from environmentalism. One of the reasons that it could be so tragic to lose a species or an ecosystem is this irrevocability of the loss. And I think that that is an area where people have become attuned to this idea of irrevocable loss, and that could make something so much worse. And I think we need to wake up to this on these larger perspectives with threats to our entire future. There are some complexities here. I won't get into them too much, but suffice to say that that population ethics is a very tricky area. It's not obvious exactly how to value the lives of future people who would never get to exist at all. If in both scenarios they exist but have much worse quality of life in one, it's easy to see what's going on. But if there are cases where we compare existence to non-existence, it's substantially more difficult. I'm inclined to the view that we count them equally, and that we, if we would lose thousands more generations of people who would have lives full of flourishing as we do today, that this is thousands of times as important as all of the flourishing today. But not everyone agrees. There are approaches that say that the slogan form is that ethics is about making people happy, not about making happy people. And the most extreme versions of this suggest that there would be nothing wrong at all if humanity went extinct, or at least nothing wrong at all in terms of the value in those lives. But what I'm trying to suggest here is that you would have to have a narrow conception of value, that it was only the value in people's lives, not any of these other forms of abstract value or achievement that we often find compelling. And you would have to subscribe to this particular version of population ethics. But also, sometimes this is suggested as something that would debunk existential risk, which would make it not important at all. But it doesn't change what we just saw about the present. And it doesn't change what we're going to see about several of these other categories as well. But I did think it's worth mentioning and highlighting, and I think it's an important area as we try to understand existential risk in the future. The other area is discounting. Many economists think that lives in future generations should be assigned a lower value based on the year in which that life is lived, often with a kind of exponentially decreasing weight as time goes on. But not all economists agree. In fact, many, such as Ramsey, the economist who invented this system, thought that actually to discount the intrinsic value of lives is a great moral mistake. It's effectively enshrining our impatience as a principle by which we want to govern and make our political decisions. And I think that this is right. And then I talk about this in an appendix to my book, but I think that when it's properly understood, we can see that discounting actually doesn't make a strong case against this. Just as Nicholas Stern did, we should discount the future just at the rate of existential catastrophe. And this turns out to suggest that the future is extremely valuable, and that we must act to protect it and thus bring down that very rate. But it's not just the future that gives us reason to protect humanity from existential risk. Consider our relationship to the past. We're not the first generation. Our cultures, institutions, and norms, our knowledge, technology, and prosperity were gradually built up by our ancestors over the course of 10,000 generations. Humanity's remarkable success has been entirely reliant on our capacity for intergenerational cooperation. Without it, we would have no houses or farms, we would have no traditions of dance or song, no writings, no nations. Burke, the political theorist, put this especially well. He said that society is a partnership in all science, a partnership in all art, a partnership in every virtue and in all perfection. As the ends of such a partnership cannot be obtained except in many generations, it becomes a partnership not only between those who are living, but between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are to be born. Indeed, when I think of the unbroken chain of generations leading to our time, and of everything that they're built for us, I'm humbled. I'm overwhelmed with gratitude and shocked by the enormity of the inheritance and at the impossibility of returning even the smallest fraction of the favor. Because 100 billion of the people to whom I owe everything are gone forever, and because what they created is so much larger than my life and than my entire generation. This thought might give us reasons to safeguard humanity that are grounded in our past, obligations to our grandparents as well as to our grandchildren. If our generation were to drop the baton, succumbing to an existential catastrophe, we would fail our ancestors in many different ways. We would fail to achieve the dreams they hoped for as they worked towards building a more just world. We would betray the trust they placed in us, their heirs, to preserve and to pass on their legacy. And we would fail in any duty that we had to pay forward the work that they did for us, to help the next generation as they helped ours. Moreover, we would lose everything of value from the past that we might have reason to preserve. Extinction would bring with it the ruin of every cathedral and temple, the erasure of every poem in every tongue, the final and permanent destruction of every cultural tradition that the earth has known. In the face of serious threats of extinction or of a permanent collapse of civilization, a tradition rooted in preserving or cherishing the richness of humanity would also cry out for action. And finally, we might have duties to the future that arise from the flaws of the past. For we might be able to make up for some of our past wrongs. If we failed now, if humanity went extinct this century, we could never fulfill any duties we might have to repair the damage we've done to the Earth's environment, cleaning up our pollution and waste, restoring the climate to its pre-industrial state, returning ecosystems to their vanished glory. If we play our cards right, humanity is at an early stage of life. We're still in our adolescence, looking forward to a remarkable adulthood. And like an adolescent, we're rapidly coming into our full power and are impatient to flex our muscles, to try out every new capacity the moment that we acquire it. We show little regard for our future. Sure, we sometimes talk of the long term, but we usually mean the next decade or two. A long time for a human, but a moment for humanity. And in thinking about this, we notice that humanity is incredibly impatient. If we think of our life, the lifespan of humanity in terms of a typical life of 1 million years for a mammalian species, then humanity, is in our adolescence, but also each year of time is just like an hour in a person's life. And so we can't think beyond the next election cycle, to say the next 4 years, which is just like 4 hours in a life, or the next generation, just the next day in this life. And so we're just so impatient, and we risk our entire life for the benefits of the next hours or days. And we're so imprudent. We take these risks very carelessly. In fact, in many cases, we not only just misevaluate these things, but we don't even take the time to evaluate them at all. We don't even think that we could be risking this entire future and try to weigh things up. We just proceed with what occurs to us in the moment. And this analogy provides us with another lens through which to view our behavior. Rather than looking at the morality of an individual human's actions as they bear on others, we can address the dispositions and character of humanity as a whole and how these help or undercut our own chances of flourishing. And I call these civilizational virtues and vices. And, I mentioned patience and prudence, but we could also think that humanity needs more self-discipline. And when we find cases where one misstep, going in the wrong direction for 5 years or even a generation makes us give up hope for the whole future and to think that it's worthless. This is this failure, again, of the virtue of hope. I think that when we look at say, serious problems in humanity at the moment, such as factory farming, and this makes us give up hope for the future, that this is a mistake. It's like the adolescent who's feeling horrible remorse for something that they've just done and doesn't know if their life's worth living or if they're going to just cause more harm to the world than good. But I think like the adolescent, we need to look at this bigger picture and to realize that the fact that we're feeling remorse shows that we're awake and aware of these types of harms that we're causing. And we're starting to understand that and starting to aim higher in our moral thinking. And that should be the response, not despair, but striving for a more just world and then achieving that. And finally, just as Aristotle talked about the practical wisdom that's needed in order to manage and understand the virtues, I think that this also fits in with the story of humanity's escalating power and it's only slowly increasing wisdom. And we need to find that wisdom as a species, which consists of wisdom for each of us, but also ways that we can work together to actually better achieve what humanity cares about instead of failing to coordinate. And a useful thing that I find from this is thinking about the perspective of humanity. We don't often think of things at this scale. Ethics is most commonly addressed from the perspective of an individual. What should I do? Occasionally, it's considered from the perspective of a group or a nation, or even more recently, from the global perspective of everyone alive today. But we can take this a step further, exploring ethics from the perspective of humanity. And not just our present generation, but humanity over deep time, reflecting on what we've achieved over the last 10,000 generations and what we could achieve over thousands of generations to come. Doing so allows us to see how our time fits into this greater story and how much is at stake. It changes the way we see the world and our role in it, shifting our attention from things that affect the present moment to those that could make fundamental alterations to the shape of the long-term future. What matters most for humanity, and what part in that plan should our generation play, and what part should I play? Finally, the fifth of these areas that I want to look at is cosmic significance. Whether we're alone in the universe is one of the greatest mysteries of science. Eminent astronomers such as Martin Rees, Max Tegmark, and Carl Sagan have reasoned that if we are alone, our survival and our actions might take on a cosmic significance. While we're certainly smaller than galaxies and stars, and less spectacular than supernovae or black holes, we may yet be one of the most rare and precious parts of the cosmos, and the nature of such significance would depend upon the way in which we're unique. If we're the only moral agents that will ever arise in this universe, the only beings capable of making choices on the grounds of what is right and wrong, then responsibility for the history of the universe is entirely on us. This is the only chance to ever shape the universe towards what is right or what is just, or what is best for all. If we fail, then the potential not just of humanity, but of all moral action will have been irrevocably squandered. Or alternatively, if we're the only beings capable of wondering about the universe, then we might have additional reason to seek such understanding, for it would only be through us that the universe could come to know itself. And if the Earth is the only place in the universe that will give rise to life, then all life on Earth would have a key significance. Earth would be the only place where there's so much complexity in each drop of water, the only place where anything lived and died, the only place where anything felt or thought or loved. And humanity would be the only form of life capable of stewarding life itself, protecting it from natural catastrophes, and eventually taking it to flourish throughout the cosmos. The importance of protecting humanity's potential thus draws support from a wide range of ideas and moral traditions. It isn't some kind of odd or contrarian view. It doesn't rely on narrow or disputed ethical theory, but instead enjoys broad support, making the case much more robust than is commonly realized, and much more able to reach people who are coming from different moral traditions. Then finally, I want to say something about the neglectedness of this area. It's not only important, but neglected. The humanity, it's difficult to say exactly how much humanity spends on existential risk because it's unclear how to count some of our spending. For example, I don't think we should count every single penny spent on understanding climate change or on combating it as devoted to understanding existential risk. I've tried to look at all of these numbers and do some accounting of it. And while it's difficult to give a precise number, we can say with confidence that humanity spends more on ice cream than we do on protecting our future. And that is, however much we should be prioritizing that, is clearly far more than we're spending on ice cream. And similarly, the Biological Weapons Convention, that is supposed to be the peer of the nuclear and chemical weapons conventions, is so underfunded that it has less money than a typical McDonald's. There are only 2 published climate models of nuclear winter since 1991, while hundreds of missiles remain on high alert, minutes away from being fired. There's tremendous scientific work on climate change, but extremely little on scenarios that could actually threaten our continued existence, where there's warming of 6 degrees or more. Another reason it's neglected is that it's an intergenerational global public good. This means that if we think about, say, the UK, where I'm based, the UK only has about 5% of actually only about 1% of the world's people. And so the harms that would befall us with an existential catastrophe, the UK only bears 1% of those harms. So therefore, it would expect us to underinvest in preventing it. And it's even worse than that, because it's an intergenerational global public good, where actually most of the harm isn't even on our generation, but is on generations to come who are unrepresented in political discourse. So we can see why, despite its extreme importance, why it gets neglected. Another reason is the short timescales of politics, obsessed with the days of the news cycle or a few years of the election cycle. And the lack of an active constituency. Political science shows that issues tend to fail when there isn't a small group of people who bear most of the relevant costs, who therefore it's worth their time to campaign and push for change. And then it's also too big. This is something where when I've talked to people in government, they've agreed that it seems like a very important issue, but that it's above their pay grade. That they it's just too big for them to think about in the normal everyday life of being a politician. But they're not actually passing that up to the United Nations or another group to take responsibility. So if nation states aren't willing to take responsibility and they're not willing to pass it up to a higher level to give them the responsibility, then it just goes unfulfilled. And it's also too big for individuals to really understand or to be able to grasp. We have to think in terms of the numbers, but we can't just directly feel it. Humanity is good at direct compassion. But what we need here is this larger compassion, compassion for our entire future, which is much harder to come by. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, it's neglected because it's so recent. Ultimately, these risks have only really come to the fore since 1945 with the development of nuclear weapons. Even though the natural risks have been around before that, it was only in 1980 that we discovered that asteroids had killed the dinosaurs. We really saw that they posed a real risk to humanity and that natural risks could wipe out species. So this is something where this recency, I think, is actually a really good sign because it helps explain why there's still a lot of hope that people will engage with these issues and will take them forward. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Toby. That was great. So now we're going to move into a Q&A for the remaining time we have. So I'll give a combination of questions from the audience and also a few that I've prepared in advance. So to start off, I think for many, and definitely for me, a surprising takeaway from this talk and your book is the large difference in magnitude among risk estimates, both between natural and anthropogenic risks, and even among anthropogenic risks. So for example, between transformative AI and nuclear war, for example. And I think many of us are wondering if you could elaborate on how you get to these estimates and what factors make these risks have such differing probabilities.
Sure. Ultimately, I don't think we should be surprised to find that the risks vary in their probability across many orders of magnitude. I think there's something initially surprising about this, but in science and the science of probability and risks, we find it's often the case that you get these power law type distributions where a few things end up taking up most of the share. And then even though there are many other aspects that they, perhaps involve vanishingly small shares. And in some cases with the natural risks, we have some good objective evidence to go on for that. For example, if we look at these different risks, say asteroids, supervolcanoes, and supernovae, we find that we can do something to calculate the chance that a supernova goes off close enough to affect the Earth. And it is just extremely small. It's not the kind of thing that we should expect to happen in the entire lifetime of the Earth. That would be surprising. And even then, it's not clear that it would actually cause that much harm. So this is an area when we can see the numbers, we see that some of these things are much more likely than others. Asteroids are much more likely than that, and supervolcanoes much more likely again. That said, I think that when it comes to the anthropogenic risks, it's much more subjective. That is to say that the relevant probabilities can't be produced from looking at long-term track records because we just don't have enough track record to do it. But that doesn't mean that you can say that the probability is zero. Instead, we need to think of probabilities in this evidential sense. What does our evidence require us to have as our credence on these things? And that's difficult to work out. And so while I try to give some probabilities for this, I also try to be clear about what I mean by them. It's not the case that the examples I give in my book or the information about each risk, just a few pages for each one, is supposed to compel people to the number I give as a probability. It's more that I feel that we should be talking in terms of our, what are our current best guesses, and that we should put numbers on these things. And that so I thought it would be doing people a disservice to say, we have looked at all of these risks. I think some of them are much more serious than others. that's all I'm going to tell you. I'm not going to tell you how much more serious. I'm not going to quantify anything. And that it also helps. It helps with these arguments because you get some skeptics like you get skeptics like Steven Pinker, who suggest that those people who are concerned about existential risk think that the world is going to be destroyed, and that this causes various problems of self-defeatingness and despair and things like that. But actually, I encounter very few people who are looking at existential risk who think it's more likely than not that the world won't make it through the next century. So it's useful to, my 1 in 6 overall number is usefully trying to say, I think that the humanity's potential will probably be intact at the end of this century. And that's partly because we will wake up to these issues and that we will take serious actions to protect ourselves. But it's hard to say much more than that. Each particular risk has, I did break them down and have some of my own private documents trying to work out how much extinction risk they could cause versus collapse risk, and what's the chance we'd be able to recover from the collapse as opposed to a collapse that you couldn't recover from. In general, I'm quite optimistic about recovering from a collapse because of the fact that that civilization, so agriculture and related aspects of being able to build towns and settlements and writing have arisen 5 times independently in the history of the world. And we probably would have been more times, except for the fact that civilization had spread everywhere around the world, so we didn't get to witness that. So our track record actually suggests that it's not that hard to reestablish, which I'm happy about. So that's where the numbers come from, and they're more of here's a concise encapsulation of how likely Toby Ord sees these things. And it's a kind of food for thought or a challenge, or to say, oh, okay, I thought you were saying that these things were more, say asteroids were bigger than that. Now I see your number. Actually, my main disagreement is on this other risk. Let's talk about that one.
One of our top audience questions is, of all the issues and concerns that you mentioned in the precipice, which keeps you up at night, or which risks do you see as most dangerous, and why?
Yeah, I guess it's in line with my with my table of estimates. So that I think bio risk and AI are the ones that keep me up at night. I think probably bio in the slightly shorter timescale, and AI with the risk kind of peaking a bit later. But still perhaps within a decade from now. The progress is very quick. And in general, with the risks as I see them, the ones that I think are higher are also more speculative. But I want to be clear that even if you thought that there was no chance that AI was going to cause any kind of existential catastrophe, absolutely zero, I still think that the other risks pose ample danger to motivate all of this concern.
Yeah, definitely. So shifting gears a little bit, you discussed in your talk 5 different ways of framing the importance of mitigating existential risks. So in terms of the present, future, past, virtue, and cosmic significance. And in the precipice, I think you mentioned that lost future potential is what you consider to be the chief motivator for you to work on these issues. I'm curious to hear what aspects of existential risk reduction seem most salient to others, especially the large multinational and government actors you've advised. And in particular, I'd love to hear more about your work advising the United Nations and your contribution to the UN Human Development Report on existential risk and the protection of humanity's long-term potential.
Okay, yeah. The part of the answer is I don't really know which of these most inspire people at the moment. I would have hoped to have found out more about that in the year since the book came out, in kind of traveling around and talking to lots of people about this. But sadly, all such plans had to be put on ice, and so I'm hoping when things open up more to be able to get more of a kind of vox pop response to this, from talking to hundreds of people from the general public, and also policymakers, and try to find out which of these ideas do move them. I think that the most solid case is that based on the present. And I think that the case that suggests the biggest importance, the gravest importance, would be the one based on the future. But it was, I think that a lot of the conversation in circles of people who look at existential risk had been mainly about, I guess, the present and the future. And so I guess that's not quite right. These three astronomers I mentioned who'd looked at cosmic significance are all very active in talking about existential risk. It's a fascinating confluence of astronomers and existential risk. But I found that thinking about the past was really influential on me when I was writing the book. I really, in trying to prepare the first chapter, where I zoom out and look at how do we get to the situation we're in, and how does it compare to the importance of other really time periods that are agreed to have been crucial in humanity's history, such as the Industrial Revolution. I really felt, I don't know, as almost a kind of spiritual experience or something, in terms of understanding where I fit in among this much greater story and the 100 billion people to whom I owe almost everything. And that really got me thinking. And when I came to writing the chapter on this sources for the importance, I really found that there were a lot of cases based on the past, which I hadn't put much stock in. And but I think there's a lot of serious cases. I should also say that one doesn't have to believe all of these different 5 areas. There are 5 that I find very plausible and very powerful. But ultimately, the idea is it's a disjunctive case, that if any of these really work, then there is a kind of great significance. But I think it's also useful in terms of talking to others and being able to show that even if they come from a very different perspective to you, that there could be one of these lenses through which it becomes obvious to them that this is of indeed great importance.
So on that note, our top audience question is, seeing as human extinction is inevitable, why is it important to prevent it from happening earlier rather than later, seeing as the achievements and values of humanity would come to an end anyway? And also there's the element of, if no one will be there to miss these losses once extinction has occurred, how bad is it really? So how would you respond to this?
Yeah, so I think I remember being tempted by this when I was much younger, thinking that that in some ways, if I were threatened with death, that it would be more comforting if there was going to be nothing afterwards or something like that, for some kind of reason, a bit like this. But I now think that this is a kind of species level version of the Epicurean argument. So this is a famous argument in philosophy, that death isn't bad for you because you're not there to experience it. It's not bad for you before you die, and then at all times after you're dead, there's no you there for it to be bad for. Something like that. Ultimately, I feel that, like many other people, that this argument is flawed and that it's a form of sophistry. That there's something about this form of it that sounds right. Yeah, how could it be bad for you at that time? But the mistake is thinking that there's this kind of badness at a time property or something that's going on. What's really happening is that it's good to be alive at the times where you are alive, and then there's no goodness at those other times, and so there's less goodness overall. And an event which makes it so that there's a lot less goodness in your life is a bad event. It's not bad because it adds badness, but it's bad because you lose goodness. And that's a common way we talk about badness. If a child undergoes some serious trauma, which means that they, let's suppose there's no suffering at the moment, but their capabilities are greatly reduced and they'll have much less happiness in their life. We think that that's a really bad thing that happened to them. That's a common sense way. Similarly, I think that what would be bad is that humanity would have much shorter life, and a life that achieves much less, that lives up to its potential much less, with much less flourishing. And as I said, there may be there may be wrongs that we've committed that we could actually in some ways make amends for, that we'd never get a chance to do. It's kind of like with an individual going to your grave with unfinished business. So that's basically my answer, is that no one really believes the Epicurean argument. People might claim to believe it, but they still look both ways when they cross the road. They don't say, well, whatever, it's not bad for me to be hit by a car, so fine. So at least so long as it kills me. We don't try to make cars more dangerous so that they never injure people, only kill them, because killing them is not bad at all. I mean, that would be crazy for anyone to actually think that would be a good government policy. And similarly, I think it would be crazy to think that there's nothing wrong with nuclear war that kills everyone, and thus no need to avoid it. In fact, if things were going badly, might as well just produce it because it's not bad. I think there's something kind of thing where we get caught up in that in the philosophy room, but then when we kind of think about the wider world and what arguments actually fly with people, we realize that it can't work.
Yeah, definitely. So I wanted to shift gears once more and talk a bit more about your past experiences. So you've started Giving What We Can, co-founded the Effective Altruism movement, written The Precipice, among many other accomplishments. So I'm curious to hear what inspires this entrepreneurial spirit in you, and how have you determined what projects to work on, and what lessons others who are hoping to have a huge social impact, much like yourself, can learn from your past experiences.
It's interesting. I guess when I first came to be looking at global poverty, a lot of what was written about it was from a perspective, say Thomas Pogge and Peter Singer, of the injustice and the moral obligations upon us. So a kind of very sober perspective. And I found when I came to research how much good we could do in this, and to realize that there were some ways of trying to do good that were vastly more effective than others, and in fact vastly more effective than other ways we could spend money on ourselves and so forth. I found that I was much more inspired by how much good we could do than I was motivated by thoughts of what we owe. And I think overall, even if in doing so I've ended up fulfilling my obligations better, I'm fulfilling them not because of focusing on them through that lens, but through focusing and just being excited about how much I could do. And ultimately, I became more excited about that than about many other things that I could work on. I was also studying computer science and abstract mathematics, which was very fun and interesting. But ultimately, I became even more excited about doing good in the world once I realized how much was possible. And the same is kind of true when it comes to existential risk, that I guess maybe that's a difference between this lens based on the past. Maybe I guess I've got a version of the lens based on the past that's still inspirational or something, or at least through this gratitude, which is a kind of positive emotion. But when I think about the future, I think it's inspiring how high our potential is, how much we could achieve if only we get through this time and we keep striving to achieve this and to hope for a better world and to create it. And so in both cases, I'm much more inspired about what good we can do. And then to notice, if I notice that other people aren't doing it and it's neglected, at some level, again, that's sad that it's neglected. It's a tragedy. But from a personal level, it makes me inspired to realize that I can go out there and try to really push the needle on this thing.
Right. And for community members who are motivated to mitigate existential risks, what efforts do you think are most promising for concretely bringing these risks down?
That's a really good question. And ultimately, I'm not sure. I guess it depends how concrete. I think that there are projects, existing projects that have been going on for decades, such as the nuclear disarmament movement. If you look at this recent movement on that, right, with the treaty that bans nuclear weapons, which has been agreed by enough member states that I think it's coming into force this year or next year. It's not going to change everything because none of the nuclear states are actually going to follow it. But it is going to change international norms, and it's going to make it harder for new states to attain nuclear weapons, or for states to ally with those states that have them by giving them bases and so forth. I think it's going to change things. But it's interesting that it's something that we would have thought was impossible recently, but shows that there's a lot of room for actual action. And so I think that donating to organizations like NTI that work on these things is a very concrete thing people could do. But I think in some ways, the biggest thing is continuing this discussion, being excited about it, being interested, talking to people deeply and seriously about it, be they your family or friends or colleagues, and really trying to strive towards a better future.
Awesome. Last question, because I know we're running out of time. So based on your experience in past conferences like this, do you have advice to attendees for how to get the most out of this conference? And additionally, do you have resources you recommend for attendees as follow-up after the conference, other than your book, of course?
In terms of, recommendations, I mean, definitely, talking to people is usually the best. All of the break time in conferences is usually the best time. It's a bit trickier in this day and age, but making contacts and also trying to follow up with people, making a note of which cities these people are in to try to get in touch with them, or which places on the internet they frequent. The Effective Altruism Forum is a good place to have a lot of these conversations. A lot of people interested in these topics and quite insightful commenters. That'd be my main recommendations.
Perfect. All right, that's all the time we have for this session. Thank you again, Toby, for a wonderful session and for spending time with us today. As per Toby's recommendation, we invite everyone attending to use SwapCard to find fellow conference attendees who share your interests and set up meetings. If you need any assistance, visit our help desk on SwapCard. Thanks for coming, and we hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you so much.